Well, my dad and mom were both in the Army in the 40s. They met during World War II at an arsenal base in New Jersey, and he got transferred to Detroit to help turn the auto production into wartime vehicles. So they settled in Detroit, and all five of us kids were born there. And my mother had a great love of music. She had all the Broadway musicals. My dad liked trumpet music, Harry James and Bert Kempfert and other people like that. And so I grew up in a musical household, even though nobody else played an instrument. My sister in 1957 got a piano and lessons. And she got the lessons, but I got the desire. And I would sit on the steps and watch her lesson. This was at 6 and 7 years old. And then go down, she'd run out to play when the teacher left, and I'd go down and play her lesson. So at a very young age, I started playing music, and it was the piano to start with. I went through a couple other instruments, but then in 1961, I got my first guitar, and that changed everything. That I was able to get into a band. I was only 10 years old. My voice hadn't changed yet. And I sang The Lion Sleeps Tonight because my voice hadn't changed yet, and I had the falsetto voice in the band. Then in 1963, I formed the group The Ascots. And the Ascots were in 7th grade, I think. Yeah, 7th grade, because it was the year Kennedy was shot. We were at a parochial school, and the nuns let us use the church basement for rehearsal. So after school, a couple days a week, we'd all rehearse in the church. And in 1963, we played our first gig for money. So I went professional at the age of 12. And then in 1965, August of 65, we recorded our record, which is a cult classic today. So the Ascots had regional success with our record, and we opened for the Turtles on the Happy Together tour. We got radio airplay in Detroit and Windsor. We had a good run. We played a lot of college shows. It was just, for a bunch of kids, it transformed our life, especially opening for the Turtles before 12,000 people. When you're 15. But it eventually ran its course. And the band, when we all started driving, our tastes changed, and the bass player quit the band to join the Felice brothers, who I had been with before the Ascots, formed a band called The Tribe. Well, Joe and Paul Felice were brothers. Bob Palmier played bass, and Joe played drums, and Paulie played keyboards, and I played lead guitar. And we made another record in 1967, or 1968, called Maple Street Park, which was another regional thing. We got on television with that. And I left the Ascots to join the Tribe in 67, and we disbanded. The singer moved away the next year, and so that was the end of that band. But the Tribe, we were managed by Punch Andrews, which was Bob Seger's manager, and we opened a lot for Seger and played the various hideout clubs in Detroit, which were owned by Punch Andrews, and he booked the bands he managed in there, so we had really good exposure. Then in 1969, I formed a band called the Electric Blues Band, and we made an album, and it was originally on Elektra, but they fired us when they were sold to WEA. They called from 70 artists on Elektra, they called it down to 14, and we got tossed out. So that was the end of that band. And then in 1969, a producer named Don Davis bought United Sound Systems in Detroit, which was the largest independent studio. It's actually where Motown started before they had their own studio at Hitsville. And Don had been a producer at Motown during the golden years. Barry never paid him what he was supposed to, so he quit and went to Stax, ran Stax through their golden years, and then came to Detroit, back home to Detroit, and bought the studio and decided that for both Motown and Stax, having a house band was the most beautiful way to go, because they had the same performers on each record, and the consistency on the label was really good because it was the same band. Like all those Stax records, that's all the same guys. And so he formed a group in Detroit called the Company, and in 1971 I got the guitar position. I was the only white guy in the rhythm section, and we made over 125 soul records. It was quite a time in my life. It was my college education, working for so many different artists like Curtis Mayfield, Isaac Hayes, Johnny Nash, the Spinners, people like that. We all became very comfortable with each other. The percussion player, Tiki Fullwood from the Parliaments, he didn't like me. He didn't think there should have been a white man in the band. But Don Davis said, no, he's our guy. And the band would rehearse at the studio, and then when a producer, or when Don Davis would hire us to run a session, there would be the artist and their representative. And in February of 1972, I went into the studio, and there was Johnny Nash, and we played on I Can See Clearly Now. And that went to #1. That was my first #1 record. I played guitar on it, and we cut that track, and we had the take. We knew it was a radio hit. Don really guided us well. And I have this Odyssey synthesizer from those days, and it does all kinds of weird noises as well as simulating instruments. And they said, what can you do with that thing? And I said, well, it's got a great harmonica. And I set up the patch. It's all manual for the harmonica patch. But I left the octave switch down 2 octaves. So it sounded like a squeeze box. They said, can you play a part on that for this song? And I came up with that ba-dun, 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 da-dun line, and that's played on the ARP Odyssey. So I got, instead of 150 for the record, I got 300 because I played 2 instruments. After I Can See Clearly Now, a couple months later, Billy Paul came into the studio, and he wanted to record, well, Don wanted him to record me and Mrs. Jones with us because they had recorded a version in New York and nobody liked the rhythm track. So they came to Detroit, and we cut that song of an evening in 1972. So that also went to #1 on the R&B charts. I don't know where it charted on the pop charts, though. That eludes me. But that was a great song. I've been asked to play it since, and I don't remember it. I played it one evening 48 years ago, and never played it since. One day we were taking a smoke break outside the studio back in the alley, and a long black limousine pulled into the alley and drove up right behind the rear door to the studio, and out got 2 great big guys, and one of them opened the door, and out stepped Isaac Hayes. And we had no idea we were going to be working with him that day, and that was a high point of my session guitar days. was working with Isaac Hayes. Then also we worked with Curtis Mayfield. So Curtis Mayfield was in the studio in 1973 after Superfly. And he was a big artist at that point. Of course, he had an original hit with the Impressions, People Get Ready, years before. And he didn't like some of the chording I was using, and he stepped on over and took the guitar from me, and he said, "These two strings, the E and the A, don't worry about them. The bass and the piano have them covered. Play the top four strings." And then he showed me some chord inversions to get a funkier track. And it changed my playing style forever. I became Johnny Wah-Wah practically. It was just, I was playing on all these records and a whole bunch of that wackadoo, wackadoo, wackadoo kind of stuff. And it became kind of my trademark. They ended up calling me the Blue-Eyed Soul Brother. There was a big record that we did called I'll Be Around that we played the rhythm track on up into the top 10 in the pop charts, as well as number 1 on the R&B charts. And that was a real quick session. We would make up the arrangements as we went. We had chord charts and lyric charts, but we didn't have sheet music. And the chord charts were the Nashville numbering system, using Roman numerals to indicate the changes. Because a song might be written in one key, but a singer has to sing it in another key. And so that happened a number of times where the key changed, but you just follow the chart and played the changes indicated on the chart. So that was how we did it. We also had free rein to come up with our own parts. So the drummer, piano player, and bass player would sort of bang out the rough arrangement based on the charts, and then we'd all add our own individual flavors in and come up with the arrangements that way, and that's what we did for I'll Be Around. It was a collaboration amongst the rhythm section that came up with that arrangement. There were a lot of them that came through. Sometimes we never even met the singer. The rhythm section at United Sound was given free rein to come up with our own parts. And so usually the piano player, drummer, and bass player, Alton Lavallis, great bass player, would pound out the original chart, and then we'd all start interpreting it and playing our instruments around that foundation. We generally worked 3 nights a week for almost 3 years. Sometimes we'd get to the studio and there would be a songwriter there, but not the artist. We wouldn't know who the artist was even. And we'd, with the songwriter there, Herbie Ross was one of the main songwriters for Don. He would sit down and sing a scratch track to it, and we would come up with the arrangement. And then there were a couple of times that I heard a song on the radio that we had done like that and never met the artist. So that was pretty interesting. Herbie Ross worked for Don. He was a songwriter in Detroit in the early 70s, and he had written My Pretending Days Are Over for the Dells, which I was on, and it was a hit for them. He would come in and sing a scratch vocal track while we came up with the arrangement. And oftentimes I never even met the artist. When Herbie was writing songs, we didn't know who was going to eventually sing them. Don and Herbie did, but the band was left out of that loop. So we cut a lot of tracks that didn't make it on the radio, but then every once in a while I'd hear a song on the radio that we played on, and it would be an artist that I never heard of or an artist that I did hear of, and I would have never met them and never heard the arrangement. I mean, the singing, except when it came out. So we did a lot of production for Mike Terry at Epic Records in New York. And Mike was the one who produced I Can See Clearly Now. And he knew he had a hit on his hands, but they didn't have a good enough rhythm track. Johnny had recorded the basic album in Kingston, Jamaica, and the sound wasn't up to US radio standards. So they brought the song to us, and we cut the radio version that you hear today. The union represented the rhythm section. We were all union members. We got paid scale or better. Don paid us very well for the parts that we did. Well, the company, the rhythm section at United Sound, was all union members, and we got paid well, but we didn't get any credit on the records for what we did. We were a work for hire under the contract law. So our contributions, especially the arrangements, went uncompensated in a certain way because nobody knew who we were. We weren't credited on records. Sometimes the artist's band itself was credited on the record, and we weren't. We were the ghost rhythm section. So I was with the rhythm section for almost 3 years, and we also backed up live artists, Junior Walker and people like that, Mary Wells. We would take the thing out as a sole review, and we would be the band for all the singers. But eventually, I got tired of it. I didn't like the live performing with the rhythm section because we were doing all other people's material. I had to learn a whole ton of stuff, and I just didn't enjoy it so much. But it was a good experience. We were on the road. After the rhythm section, I formed a band called Meadow in the suburban Detroit area in 1973, and we had a lead singer who played trumpet, myself on keys and guitar, Andy James on bass, Larry Bellhumer on drums, and Tim Kraft on lead guitar. And we made some recordings, but we never released a record. But we went on tour on the bigger club circuit. So for about 2 years, we were on the circuit playing clubs, living in the truck, that whole wonderful musician coming of age experience. And there was no money in it to speak of, but we were able to pay our bills. That morphed into a group called Zurich, Z-U-R-I-C-H, like the town in Switzerland. Same drummer, myself, and 3 other guys formed that band. And we did make a little record called Travelin' On. And that, it didn't do anything to speak of, but we had studio experience, and we picked up on the club circuit where Meadow had left off. I still had the same agent, same manager, and they just took our new band and said, okay, you're back on the circuit. So I did another couple years on the circuit, but we were getting better rooms this time, and we played a lot in Toronto. Well, in 1975, I took up residence in Toronto with a group called High Times. And we had a small album out and went out on the road. We actually went on the CN train across Canada, performing with another couple of artists in every major city. It was really an amazing time. I got thrown out of Canada. I spent 26 hours in the immigration office in Mississauga, and they revoked my visa, and I had to move back to Michigan. So that band broke up, and the drummer and I moved back home to Michigan and started playing a little lounge act. But then we got stranded in a snowstorm in Pennsylvania in February of '77, and the truck broke down. The heater didn't work, obviously. We darn near died, and we got rescued by a snowplow a few hours later and taken to a Howard Johnson's to warm up. And then we had to get the truck towed, repaired, and all that. It was a real drag. And in the van that night, three of us, Tom Shaw, Larry Bellhumer, and myself, all decided that we weren't putting up with winter anymore. We were through with winter. We were through with being on the road when it's icy and snowy out. And we all moved to Sunshine States. So that band broke up, and I moved to Phoenix. So did Larry, the drummer. And Tom Shaw moved to San Francisco and became quite an accomplished piano player and well known there. He's a solo piano player, and he backs up people in stage shows and things like that. He's done very well. Larry unfortunately passed earlier this year. I was with him for 9 years. He was a great drummer and a good friend. And moved to Phoenix, Arizona, and got a job playing bass for Steppenwolf. John Kay and the band were recording in Studio A at Pantheon Studios in Scottsdale, Arizona. And I was recording in Studio B with Larry, the drummer, and Tim Kraft, the old guitar player from Meadow. We were doing a new record of original songs. And we would pass each other in the lounge area and got to talking, and we went in and listened to some of their stuff, and they came in and listened to some of our stuff. And John said, "Who's that bass player?" And I said, "Well, it's me." And he said, "I have a proposition for you." And he asked me to join the touring band. And so I did. And for about 7 months, I was the bass player for Steppenwolf on the road. John Kay, the leader of Steppenwolf and the singer, and one of the songwriters, does not drink, does not smoke. And so he didn't tolerate it in the band. And one night, the guitar player, Kent Henry, who lived in Portland, and I got really loaded in a hotel lobby, and we were both a little less than stellar that night on stage. So we got canned, and in Yuma, Arizona. And after Steppenwolf, I got a gig playing bass for Hoyt Axton. His other bass player, Buffalo Bruce Barlow, quit and went back to the Lost Planet Airmen, where he had been from, Commander Cody. So I filled in one night with Hoyt in Phoenix at Mr. Lucky's. He asked me to continue the tour. He was making a movie called Cloud Dancer at the time, and so he would play in the location they were at. In this case, they were filming at the airport in Mesa, Arizona, so he did some shows in Phoenix. I picked those up. We went out and did tour a little bit, but as I said, my wife was real antsy about that. And I quit the band after just a few months because I didn't want to risk my marriage. So when we got married, we went to Maui for our honeymoon. And her family lived there, and we stayed 2 weeks with her parents and went all around the island, fell in love with it, came back, sold everything, and moved to Maui. I sold everything but 2 guitars and my Hammond organ and moved it all to Maui. I lived there 14 years. In Maui, I didn't work for about 6 months. I had some money left, and then it became time. I had to earn a living, and I went out and I sold printing jobs for my stepfather-in-law, and he owned a printing firm. So I would go do hotel menus, office forms, all that other drudgery. And one of the clients was Valley Isle Broadcasting in Maui, KHEI and KVIB FM. And I went in to sell them printing. And the program director heard my voice and he said, "I'd like to speak with you." And I said, "Okay, what about?" And he said, "I've got an opening on the weekend evenings for a DJ. And I really think your voice would be good, and you know this equipment from being in the studio." And so he offered me a job, and I went part-time on the radio in Maui on KVIB FM. Well, that was a country format, and it was it was struggling, let's say. It was not doing real well. They were trying to package spots with the AM station, and they weren't making any money. And I suggested adding Hawaiian music to the country music because they're so similar. They go together so well. And the owner of the station said, "No, we have a format." And I argued and I said, "I think you're going to get more business if we play to the local taste." And so he allowed me to play 2 songs an hour to start with. Eventually it went up to 4 songs an hour. And eventually I changed the format to 50-50, Hawaiian and country music, and we shot up to number 2 in the market. So that was a good success story. I got hired away by KMVI AM in 1984 to do their morning show. I split it with a fellow named Greg Howard. And then 1984, I started producing Hawaiian records while working at the radio station. And I made some that we played on the radio. I was using a commercial studio in Maui called The Winery, and they had their monitor speakers were bad, so I bought $8,000 worth of JBL speakers to put in their studio. They didn't have a digital reverb, so I bought a digital reverb, and I thought, you know, I could just do this myself. I was living on a working ranch in Kula, Maui, and they had a U-shaped bunkhouse that was rented out as apartments. I lived in the middle one. They had a saddlery room that wasn't used anymore up behind the riding arena, and I set up my gear in there and started making Hawaiian records at the ranch. And it worked out really well. So well that another radio station came along, KLHI in Lahaina, 100,000 watt FM, the most powerful station in Maui. And they wanted me to take over the news department and the morning show. And so they hired me and we built the station. I worked there 1 year and it was just not any fun doing the news. So I left radio for a while and concentrated on my little studio. Then I got to be too much of a bother to the people at the ranch with all the noise and traffic. So there was a music store in Kahului, Maui, down by the airport called Bounty Music. And they had a big storage area next to the store that they weren't using. And I went in and built a control room and a playing room and opened up as Maui Recorders down on Dairy Road in Kahului, next to Bounty Music, and started a Hawaiian record label called Maui Zone Records and Tapes. And so I started producing acts and releasing them, and all these guys worked in the hotels and that, so they had good public exposure, and I would run off 1,000 cassettes and place them in the hotel gift shops and the local record stores and things like that. And they took off. I did 26 albums in the course of the years that I ran the label till 1989, and only one didn't make money, and that was because the artist, who was originally from the Big Island of Hawaii but lived in Maui and played the hotel circuit and had a really killer voice, I did an album on him, and he left Maui and retired on the Big Island right after the album was done, so I didn't have the artist to support the record, and that one bombed. So I was working in the studio only now, and working on the record label. I'm going to backtrack a minute. One guest on my radio show in April of 1992 came in to shill for the whales, the Pacific Whale Foundation. And Greg Kaufman was the founder and leader of it. And he was also a good friend with Walter Becker from Steely Dan. So at 7:15 in the morning, I get a knock on the studio door. So I open the studio door, and there's standing Walter Becker. And I said, "I know you." And he says, "No, I only look like him." He says, "Don't mention my name on the air. I'm just here to talk about Whale Day." So we did, and it went off fine. And then he wanted to stay and pick records. So he sits down on the floor. I'm standing up at the turntables and cart machines and all that in the console. And he sits down on the floor and starts handing me up albums saying, track 3, side 2, track 1, side A, that sort of thing. And so he was programming the music that morning. The owner heard it on the way into work, got all upset. He came stomping into the studio when he got to the office and said, "What's going on? The music is real weird today." I pointed at Walter and I said, "That's Walter Becker from Steely Dan." And he goes, "Oh my God, put him on the air." I said, "I already did. He was the Whale spokesman. He just wants to sit here and play records for a little while." So that was my introduction to Walter. And he came and ghost DJ'd a couple of times after that, and we just had a ball. Then he was producing an album called China Crisis at George Benson's Lahaina Sound Studio in Lahaina, Maui, and wanted to rent some guitars from me and wanted me to sort of be the guitar tech on that session. We became friends and we worked with each other off and on. He sold me a couple of guitars, and I stayed friends with him. In 1989, he came into my studio and brought me a pickup truck load full of old Steely Dan outtakes and alternate mixes. A truckload full of reel-to-reel tapes and all that. I had a DAT recorder, which was the first one in Maui, and he wanted to go through the 2 tracks, select songs that he and Donald wanted to keep, and then he wanted me to destroy all the outtakes. So we worked 5 days in the studio going through all those songs, and I taped a phone up by the speakers so that Donald could hear the song as well in New York. They selected about an hour's worth of music that they wanted to keep, and I recorded it off to DAT, and I made a copy for both Donald and Walter. You couldn't make CDs yet in those days. This was still too early. So he paid me for that, signed the work order, and said, now I want you to destroy all these tapes. And I said, you're kidding me. And he says, no, slice them up and throw them in the dumpster. I'll pay you an extra day at $75 an hour to destroy all the Steely Dan outtakes. And I did it. I got a bottle of tequila one night and drank half of it and sliced up all the Steely Dan left in the world. I felt very bad about it. Interestingly though, Walter gave me one of the tapes. It was his copy, reel to reel, of the album Countdown to Ecstasy, which is my favorite Steely Dan album. So I have Walter's signed personal copy of that album, which I've kept as a memento. So after that, after I was done destroying the outtakes, Walter came back to the studio to sign the work order so I could get paid by MCA Records. And he said to me, this was in the fall of '89, he said, why don't we, he says, are you making any money here? And I said, yes, I am, and so is the label. And he said, but it looks like a radio station. He says, it doesn't look like a real studio. And I said, oh, I get by. You know, it's okay, I get by. And he said, why don't we shut this thing down and go build a real one? And I was flabbergasted. I said, what? And he said, yeah, he said, you do good work. You've got experience in the big studios. Let's go either find a building to build a studio in or find a piece of land to build one on. So we did. We went searching for land. I went on his payroll in September of 1989. And we went looking for a building first. We looked at an old theater, the Kula Theater in Maui, and the building itself was so deteriorated that it just would have been a fortune to turn it into a studio. Walter and his wife had 7 acres in the town of Ulupalakua, Maui, and Walter had a small redwood house on that property that he had a set of drums and a bass amp and some guitars in, and he would just go up there and wail. There was nothing but cattle pastures around. There wasn't anybody to disturb. And we kept going back to that little room to talk about what we had seen and what we thought of it and what was it going to take to actually build this thing. And he said, why don't we just build it here? So we did. We leased the land from his wife. She owned it with a former husband. And we hired an LA architect to design the playing studio as a separate building and to turn the redwood house into a control room. So by the summer of 1990, we were done. It was built. And I got us a console deal. I got us $50,000 off on a console. So we got that. We had a 3M 32-track digital tape machine, 1-inch tape running at 45 IPS. It was a very expensive tape machine. We started just fooling around with the studio, just learning the studio, doing just scratch tracks for Walter. He was composing on a computer in software, and I would take the outputs of the computer and take it to the tape machine, and we would just learn how to work the whole thing. Then in December of 1990, we had Willie Nelson in. He had lost his guitar in the IRS seizure. So I loaned him my Martin guitar, and he had it for 6 months till he got his guitar back. He signed it for me when he gave it back to me. He says, John, I got to give you something for this. It's a mighty fine guitar, and I've had it a long time. And I handed him a Sharpie and my guitar, and I said, "Start my trigger," which is his guitar with all the names on it and the hole in it and all that. So he did. And he and I made a record in the Maui studio, which was a recreation of some of his greatest hits, so that he could sell it on late night TV, not available in stores, and hopefully earn some money for his tax bill. That was quite a wonderful session, and Willie is a wonderful guy. So following Willie at the Ulupalakua studio, Donald Fagen came over to start his Kamakiriad solo album, which Walter Becker was producing. Donald had also built a studio in New York called River Sound, and basically we would work 1 month in Maui, 1 month in New York, and then they'd take a month off, and I would make another whole album in that month in the studio for my Hawaiian record label or for just a client that wanted to come in and record. And so that went on for a couple of years. Donald Fagen is the most picky person I've ever met in my life, although he's a wonderful guy. That's not an issue. But as Walter said, Donald slices a finer hair. And that's the truth. And he said, don't ever come up with an idea of your own and recommend it to Donald, because he likes all the ideas to be his. So I did that once when he was programming a synthesizer. I said, it's complex, but I know how to do that. And he just glared at me and said, no, I'm doing it. So we had Christopher Parker over from the Saturday Night Live band and Bob Dylan's touring band to play drums on that album. It was just the highest precision we had. It was finishing school for me. I was working with Roger Nichols, the immortal, who is the chief engineer for all the Steely Dan projects, and I was second engineer to him. We just spent 2 years making this wonderful record. Walter wrote the lyrics to one song, so it actually has a Steely Dan song on the album called Snowbound. And my Hammond organ is on that. It was just a wonderful time up there. We were at 2,500 feet above the Wailea Hotel Resort, and we could see 2 other islands out the control room window. It was just the most beautiful setting. We were on 7 acres up on the mountain. It was quite a time. In August of '91, we started a record for the Pahinui brothers, which is the 3 sons of Hawaii's revered Gabby Pahinui, who died on a golf course in 1980. Gabby was the Renaissance man of Hawaiian music, made slack key come back into the world when it was falling by the wayside. The 3 brothers, Bla Pahinui had his dad's emotional voice, Martin Pahinui had his dad's high falsetto voice, and Cyril Pahinui played the slack key guitar just like his dad. And I had Bla on the radio show one morning playing his new album, and I said, and this was in 1982, I said, it takes the 3 of you to equal your dad. And I explained my thoughts on that. And he says, that's funny, brah. And he says, but no can do. And I said, why? And he says, we don't get along. We don't speak to each other. And I said, oh, that's really a shame. And I kept speaking with the brothers as I would run into them over the years about getting together to do a record. And it was always one person or another didn't like the other guy or didn't want to do it. And finally, in August of '91, they agreed to do it. And so we brought them into the studio. We brought in Jim Keltner from Los Angeles on drums. He was John Lennon's drummer in the Plastic Ono band, and he's been on 1,000 records minimum. We brought in David Lindley on his Weissenborn slide guitars, and Ry Cooder on main electric lead guitar. We cut this album over about 10 days, and it became the highest selling Hawaiian album ever. It still is for sale today, 29 years later. Rai hung out with the Pahinui brothers when he was young. He lived in Oahu, so he's known them much of his life. They asked him to be part of it. So he agreed, and he says, hey, what about my friends Jim Keltner and David Lindley? And they said, oh, well, geez, why not? Let's do it. I didn't play an instrument on it. My picture's on it for engineering, but I didn't play any instruments on that album. So after the Pahinui Brothers record, we produced a couple of other records up there for Buddy Foe and for Over the Edge that were outside commercial projects. They were paying X amount per day to work in the studio. Walter didn't work on those projects. I did them myself. And we got busted by the county zoning people. We were supposed to have flower drying sheds up on the property, but in fact we had this big recording studio. The only way he could make it better and make it up to them without having to close the thing was to take it private. So he bought me out in January of 1992, and I left that studio. So I worked in radio maintenance for a year in Maui. For a couple of the radio stations I had worked for, I did their transmitter readings and maintenance and things like that, and produced another album at my home with my end of the recording gear for a band called Argentina Turner, and basically wrapped up my Maui days. So I took the money from Walter and moved the family back to Phoenix, Arizona, where I bought a house and built a fairly big studio there with a video partner. It was a 12,000 square foot building with two 4,000 square foot shooting stages with 32-foot ceilings. So I put all the gear in and hired the architect to design the control room. It was a very big control room. It was 28 feet by 31 feet. Then in the course of 18 months, I did 3 albums and 1 car commercial there in that $1 million building, and we couldn't afford to keep it. So I had to let that go. And the architect, Peter Maurer, called me up one day and said, I'm equipping a studio in Bangkok. I need somebody to find the gear that this guy wants, put the deal together, buy the equipment, aggregate it in Los Angeles for shipment. So I did that. In June of '96, Peter asked me to form a new company with the architecture firm to design the technical aspects of the studios that they were building all over the world, and to do the equipment packages, the wiring diagrams, basically the entire technical side of the studio. They wanted to be able to keep that in-house and not lose all that equipment sales and everything to other dealers. So we became dealers for most of the major recording equipment, and I started working on studios all over America, plus one in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And that was the only foreign one I did all on my own. But one of the clients that they were designing a studio for was David Lynch.